The moment the attorney looked up from his papers and saw me standing in the doorway, every drop of color left his face. His hand froze mid-air, still holding a yellow legal pad, and for a full 3 seconds, the only sound in that conference room was the hum of the air conditioning. "Mrs." he started, then stopped himself. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "Grace Holloway? The Grace Holloway?" My son turned around in his chair. He had been leaning back with that particular ease of a man who believes he has already won. What he was expecting to see was the woman he had been carefully, methodically describing to the court-appointed evaluator for the past 4 months. Confused, forgetful, a liability to herself. What he saw instead was me. Standing in the doorway in my charcoal blazer, the one I used to wear to federal depositions with a leather folder tucked under my arm, and 32 years of reading people's faces telling me absolutely everything I needed to know about this moment. The smirk he had been wearing since I walked in dissolved so completely it was as if it had never existed. I looked at him, and I said nothing. I had learned a long time ago that silence, placed correctly, does more damage than any words ever could. Let me back up, because none of this will make sense unless I tell you how we got there. I retired from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division 18 months before any of this began. 32 years tracking financial fraud, money laundering, embezzlement schemes sophisticated enough to make your head spin, and I walked away from it quietly, the way I had always done everything. No ceremony, no gold watch. I cleaned out my desk on a Thursday afternoon, drove home to the house in Asheville that my late husband and I had bought 30 years ago, and I planted a garden. I did not tell many people what I had done for a living. My son knew in the vaguest terms, government work, financial investigations, federal, but I had kept the specifics close to my chest for most of his life, partly for his safety, and partly because that was simply how I was wired. You spend 3 decades being the person nobody sees coming, and it stops being a strategy. It becomes who you are. My son, Ethan, was 41 and had his father's jawline and unfortunately very little of his father's judgment when it came to women. He had married his wife, Nicole, 4 years before all of this happened. I had smiled at the wedding. I had danced at the reception. I had told myself I was imagining things, but I was not imagining things. I had never once in my professional life ignored what my instincts were telling me, and they were telling me, from the very first dinner I shared with my daughter-in-law, that there was a seam in her somewhere, a place where the performance of her did not quite line up with the structure underneath. She was warm the way a well-trained salesperson is warm, generous with eye contact, attentive to detail, careful to remember what you had said 3 weeks ago and bring it up again in a way that made you feel seen. She was always the first to offer help, and always the first to make sure you noticed that she had offered. The kindness had the faint mechanical quality of something rehearsed. I noted it. I said nothing. She was my son's wife, and I had not been asked for my opinion. The first sign that something was actually wrong came on a Tuesday evening, about 8 months after I retired. Ethan called me while I was on the back porch with a glass of iced tea, and he asked me very casually, the way you ask about something you have been coached to make sound casual, whether I had been having any trouble with my memory lately. I told him no. He made a small sound that was not quite agreement. He said my daughter-in-law had mentioned that when she had visited me the previous week, I had asked her the same question twice, about her mother's health. He said she wasn't trying to make anything of it, she was just a little concerned, and he was just checking in because he loved me. I sat very still on that porch after I hung up. I reviewed, with the same methodical attention I had given to every case I had ever worked, every moment of my daughter-in-law's visit the previous Tuesday. I had asked about her mother once. Exactly once. I knew this the way I knew my own name, because I had spent my entire career building a memory precise enough to hold up in a federal courtroom. I did not say any of this to my son. I went inside, made a note in a small spiral-bound notebook I keep in my desk drawer, wrote the date and time and exactly what Ethan had told me, and I started paying attention. Over the next 6 weeks, the concern grew. My son began calling more often, not in the warm, easy way he had called when his father was alive, but in a careful, probing way that felt more like documentation than connection. Was I eating enough? Was I sleeping well? Had I remembered to call my doctor about my knee? Had I paid my electric bill on time? Had I been getting out of the house? My daughter-in-law sent articles. Long, thoughtful articles about early cognitive decline in women over 60. She texted them with little notes. Saw this and thought of you. No pressure, just sharing, and you're so important to us. We just want to make sure you're okay. She started stopping by unannounced, always with something, a casserole, a plant for the kitchen windowsill, a book she thought I would love, and she would look around my house with the carefully neutral expression of someone doing an inspection they are trying to disguise as a visit. I let her look. I offered her coffee. I asked about her mother's health once, and remembered her answer precisely. What I was also doing, quietly, was watching her. Old habits. She had her own small financial consulting practice boutique, she called it, working primarily with elderly clients, helping them manage their estates and investments. She had mentioned this when I first met her, and I had nodded and thought nothing of it. Now I thought about it. Now I pulled up the state business registry. Now I started paying the kind of attention to certain things that had been my entire professional life before the garden and the iced tea on the back porch. What I found, I did not find quickly. I want to be clear about that, because there is nothing dramatic about the actual work of following money. It is tedious and precise, and you have to be willing to look at spreadsheets for 8 hours on a Tuesday and feel nothing but mild professional satisfaction when a number appears where it shouldn't. I had spent 32 years doing exactly this, and I had not forgotten how. It took me 11 weeks to build a picture clear enough to be certain of what I was seeing. My daughter-in-law was skimming. Small amounts, rotated across multiple client accounts, withdrawn at irregular intervals in a pattern designed to stay below the thresholds that trigger automatic review. It was actually a fairly elegant scheme. The kind of scheme that works beautifully on clients who are elderly, isolated, and perhaps conveniently beginning to show signs of cognitive decline that make them unreliable witnesses to their own finances. The kind of scheme, I thought, that works much less well when the mother-in-law you are trying to neutralize spent 3 decades hunting exactly this. I kept my notebook. I kept my notes. I did not call my son. I did not confront my daughter-in-law. I had learned, many years ago, and in a much harder context, that you never move before you have everything you need, and you never show your hand to someone who is still watching you. Meanwhile, the campaign against me accelerated. My son called one evening and told me, very gently, that he and my daughter-in-law had been talking, and they thought it might be a good idea for me to speak to someone, a professional, just to check in, make sure everything was okay, because they loved me so much and they would never forgive themselves if something happened to me and they hadn't done something about it. He had the name of a wonderful therapist who specialized in aging adults. Very highly regarded, very sensitive approach. I told him that was very thoughtful, and I would look into it. I hung up and made a note in my spiral-bound notebook. The therapist, when I met her 3 weeks later, was a perfectly pleasant woman who asked me a series of questions I could have answered in my sleep. I answered them all correctly and completely. She seemed a little puzzled by the end of the session, and she mentioned to me that the referral had included some notes about concerning behaviors. She read them to me from a printed email my daughter-in-law had sent. The email described, in sympathetic detail, a woman who repeated herself, who lost track of conversations, who had on 2 separate occasions left the stove on, who had called my son by the wrong name during a phone call. I listened to every word. None of it had happened. I thanked the therapist for her time. I asked her to keep her assessment on file. I did not tell her what I was thinking, which was that the email my daughter-in-law had sent was not just a series of lies, it was a legal document. It was the beginning of a paper trail designed to support a very specific outcome. And that outcome, I now understood clearly, was a guardianship petition. They were going to try to have me declared incompetent to manage my own affairs. And the real reason underneath all the casseroles and the articles and the concerned phone calls was that I had a house worth $400,000, a pension, a retirement account, and no one to protect my interests except a son who had, slowly, and without fully understanding what was happening to him, been redirected by a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. I am going to tell you the truth about how I felt when I understood this completely. I sat at my kitchen table at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night with my notebook open in front of me, and I felt, for about 10 minutes, something very close to grief. Not for myself, not for the house or the money, but for my son. For the boy who used to fall asleep with his head on my shoulder during long car drives, who called me every Mother's Day no matter where in the world he was. Grief that someone had gotten inside that relationship and used it as a tool. Then I closed the notebook, went to bed, slept 8 hours, and got up the next morning and finished what I had started. I had a contact at the SEC I had worked with on a joint task force in 2009. I had a former colleague at Treasury who now consulted for state financial regulatory agencies. And I had, through both of them, a path to getting the documentation I had assembled into the right hands without my name attached to it in any way that would alert my daughter-in-law before the process was underway. I also quietly retained an attorney. Not someone from Asheville. Someone 3 counties over who had never heard of my son or my daughter-in-law and who listened to me for 2 hours, read the summary I had prepared, and told me with some care that she thought I had a very strong case, and also that I was, in her professional experience, one of the most organized clients she had ever encountered. I told her that was kind of her to say. The guardianship petition was filed 6 weeks after that conversation. My son called me the morning it happened. His voice was strained and full of a particular kind of guilt that I recognized the guilt of a person who is doing something they know is wrong but has convinced themselves is necessary. He told me he was sorry. He told me this was not about punishing me. He told me it was about making sure I was safe and taken care of, and that he and my daughter-in-law would handle everything, and I did not need to worry. I told him I understood. I told him I loved him. I meant both of those things completely. What I did not tell him was that I had been in contact with my attorney for 6 weeks, that the documentation I had assembled had already been reviewed by a federal agency, that a separate investigation into my daughter-in-law's financial practice had been opened 10 days earlier, that the petition his wife had spent 4 months engineering toward was, in my considered professional opinion, about to go very differently than she was expecting. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in a conference room at the county courthouse, not a full courtroom, just a room with a long table and too many chairs and the particular fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look slightly unwell. These things are rarely theatrical. They are administrative. Paperwork and evaluations and the quiet, grinding machinery of a system deciding who gets to be in charge of someone else's life. My son and my daughter-in-law arrived first. My attorney and I arrived 5 minutes later. I had dressed carefully that morning. Not to impress, I was long past performing for rooms, but because I have always believed that the way you carry yourself into a difficult situation tells you something about how you intend to handle it. The charcoal blazer. The good shoes. Hair up. I looked exactly like what I was, a 63-year-old woman who had walked into rooms far more intimidating than this one and walked out of all of them just fine. The attorney handling the petition on their behalf was a man named Richard Gable, and he had the sleek, confident quality of someone who did this regularly and found it straightforward. He looked up from his papers when I entered the room, the automatic professional glance of someone cataloging a new arrival, and then he looked again. His face went absolutely white. For a moment, he did not speak. Then he set down his legal pad very carefully on the table, the way you set something down when your hands are suddenly not entirely reliable. And he said, very quietly, "Grace Holloway." Not a question. A recognition. My son's head came around. My daughter-in-law, who had been arranging papers with the brisk efficiency of someone who had planned this morning down to the minute, went very still. "We've met before," I said to the attorney. It was not a question either. I did not remember him specifically, but his reaction told me everything. Somewhere in 32 years, our paths had crossed. And whatever he remembered of that crossing, it was clearly significant enough to make his carefully prepared morning feel suddenly a great deal less certain. 14 years ago, he said. The Hargrove case. You testified for the prosecution." He paused. "You took the whole defense case apart in about 40 minutes. "I remember the case," I said, which was true, though I had not remembered him. "We should probably get started." My daughter-in-law was looking at her husband. He was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on his face since he was 7 years old and had broken a window and was trying to decide whether I already knew. He did not yet understand exactly what was happening, but something in the room had shifted, and he could feel it. My attorney placed our response to the petition on the table. It was thorough. It was precise. It contained, in organized and clearly labeled sections, 32 years of professional credentials, an assessment from the therapist my son had himself referred me to, who had found no evidence of cognitive impairment, and a formal letter from my former division director attesting to my record and capabilities. It contained notarized documentation of every phone call and visit my daughter-in-law had made in the past 4 months, cross-referenced with the claims she had made to the therapist. It contained, in a sealed exhibit that my attorney had been authorized to reference, a summary of the ongoing regulatory investigation. The attorney across the table read the first 3 pages. Then he looked up at me. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "I wonder if we might request a brief recess." "Of course," I said. My daughter-in-law did not request a recess. She said, in a voice that was admirably controlled given the circumstances, that she was sure there was a misunderstanding, that everything she had done had been out of concern, that she had only ever wanted to protect me. I looked at her for a moment, just looked at her, the way I had looked at people in interrogation rooms and depositions and federal hearings for 3 decades, long enough for her to hear herself, long enough for the room to hear her. "I know you did," I said. And then I turned back to my attorney and let the process continue. The guardianship petition was dismissed within the week. That is perhaps less dramatic than you might expect, but that is how these things work when the paperwork is airtight and the professional record is what mine was. The hearing itself became less than an hour of careful, quiet procedural work, and then it was done. The investigation into my daughter-in-law's financial practice took considerably longer. These things always do. But it concluded 8 months later with a result that was entirely consistent with what I had documented. The clients whose accounts had been touched received their money back. My daughter-in-law received a set of consequences that the legal system, in its methodical way, had determined were appropriate. I will leave the specifics there, because this story was never really about her. This story is about my son. He called me the evening after the hearing. He had been quiet for 3 days. I had given him those 3 days deliberately, because I understand the particular silence a person needs when the ground has shifted entirely beneath them and they have to reorient to a completely different version of reality than the one they were living in 48 hours ago. I have given people that silence before. It is one of the more useful things I know how to do. When he called, he did not say anything for a moment. I could hear him breathing. I waited. "Mom," he finally said. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. "And I meant that too." "She told me you were." He stopped, started again. "She made it sound like you were really struggling. She was so convincing. Every time I asked you and you seemed fine, she would explain why you seemed fine and why that was actually a sign of how serious it was. And I just..." Another pause. I stopped trusting what I could see with my own eyes. "That's what people like her are very good at," I said. "That's the whole mechanism. It's not a character flaw in you. It's a technique, and it works on people who love you because they use that love as the lever." I had explained this same thing to victims' families before, in other contexts, and it never became easier. "You're not stupid, Ethan. You were targeted." He was quiet again for a while. "Why didn't you just tell me what you used to do?" he said. "All those years. I knew you worked for the government, investigations or something, but I never knew why didn't you ever just say?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because I wanted you to have a mother," I said, "not a federal agent. There's a difference in how people relate to you, and I wanted at least one relationship in my life where the other person just saw me. Not the credential, not the clearance level, not the record. Just me." I paused. I may have overcorrected on that. He made a sound that was almost a laugh, but not quite. It had some crying in it, too. We talked for another 2 hours that night. About his father, about the years I was traveling and he was home with a babysitter more than either of us would have chosen. About the shape of things I had tried to give him and the things I had failed to give him, and the complicated truth that parents are people doing their best with what they have, and sometimes it is enough and sometimes it isn't. We talked about Nicole and the early days of their marriage when he had been happy, genuinely happy, and what it felt like to understand now what had been underneath that. At one point he asked me if I was angry at him for what he had tried to do. I thought about the question carefully, which is the only way I know how to treat a question that matters. "For about 10 minutes, I said. "At my kitchen table on a Wednesday night, and then I decided it wasn't useful. He asked if I could forgive him. "There's nothing to forgive," I said. "Forgiving implies you did something. You were deceived. Those are different things." And then, because I knew he needed to hear it explicitly, "I love you." That was never in question. Not for a single day of any of this. He came to Asheville the following weekend. He helped me pull weeds in the garden, which he has always been terrible at. He has no patience for identifying what is a weed and what is something intentional, and he pulled out 2 of my best black-eyed Susans before I stationed him in a corner of the yard where I was genuinely indifferent to the outcome. We had dinner on the back porch as the sun went down, and we talked about his father and about what came next, and it was the first time in almost 2 years that I felt like I was sitting across from my son instead of across from someone else's version of him. It is slower than the movies make it look, that kind of repair. There are still phone calls where I can feel him recalibrating, learning to see me clearly again after a long period of seeing me through someone else's lens. There are still moments where I catch something careful in his voice, a guardedness that was not there before any of this happened, and I understand that some part of him is still adjusting to the fact that the world is shaped differently than he thought. I don't rush that. I am a patient woman. What I will tell you, though, is this. On a Wednesday morning in February, Ethan drove up from Charlotte with his daughter, my granddaughter Emma, who is 6 years old and who has her great-grandfather's eyes and an absolute conviction that her grandmother's garden is a magical place where regular rules about touching plants do not apply. She came barreling through my back door with muddy shoes and a fistful of wildflowers she had found at the edge of the yard, real ones this time, not my black-eyed Susans, and she presented them to me with the solemn ceremony of someone delivering a treasure of great importance. I put them in a glass on the kitchen windowsill and made grilled cheese sandwiches and let her stir the tomato soup even though she spills it every time, and we sat at my kitchen table in the winter light and ate lunch together, the 3 of us. While Emma told us at considerable length about a movie she had seen and a girl at school named Becca and the precise and serious injustice of how long it takes to get a loose tooth to fall out. My son caught my eye across the table at one point and smiled a real smile, unrehearsed, the one that still looks exactly like the smile he had when he was 7 years old and we were on our way to somewhere he was excited about. I smiled back. There is a particular thing I have thought about many times in the months since all of this resolved. People sometimes assume, when they learn what I used to do, that the work must have made me cynical. 32 years of watching people steal from each other, lie to each other, construct elaborate architectures of deception for money or power or both. They assume that seeing that much of the worst of what people are capable of must leave marks. It does leave marks. I won't pretend otherwise. But the thing nobody tells you about spending a career in financial crimes investigation is that you also become, over time, extremely good at knowing what genuine things look like. You spend so long studying counterfeits that your eye for the real thing becomes almost involuntary. You know authentic from a long way away, the way a certain quality of light looks different from everything around it, and you learn to trust that recognition absolutely. My son, sitting at my kitchen table eating grilled cheese and watching his daughter demonstrate for us the exact face she makes at Becca during the injustice of the loose tooth that is genuine. That quality of light in his face when he is not performing anything, not managing anyone's perception, not being someone's instrument that is exactly who he actually is. I spent 32 years knowing the difference between what is real and what someone wants you to think is real. I know which one this is. They thought, for a while, that they had found the seam in me, the edge of the person where you could work a lever in and pry. They thought age was the seam, that retirement was the seam, that a quiet life in a garden was the place where the formidable thing I had been for 3 decades had finally softened into something manageable. What they forgot, what they had no way of knowing, because I had been careful my whole life to let people forget, was that the garden was a choice, the quiet was a choice. I had put those things down the way you set down a credential when you walk into a room where you want to be seen as just a person, and the credential does not stop being true because you put it down. You can retire from an agency. You cannot retire from 32 years of knowing exactly how this works. By the time they remembered that, it was already done.